I think you need to know a lot of places you're not going to go be able to blend in with the population locally. I
Right.
mean, I know I'm not, right? I'm not going to sub-Saharan Africa and it's going to be easier, seamless where I blend in, but I can be as unobtrusive as I can be. I can be as kind of plain looking as I can be without all those extra trappings and so forth. Yes, 100%.
Welcome to More Than the Gun. I'm your host, Harry Arruda. Join me as we dive into the multifaceted world of risk mitigation, public safety, and everything in between. Welcome back. Today we're honored to have global security and travel risk expert Patrick Kane on the show to share his insights on travel security and what challenges companies, executives, and employees face today during corporate travel. Patrick, welcome.
Hey, Harry, how are you?
Excellent. So with the state of world affairs, the increase in overseas kidnapping and illegal detentions, this travel security is a hot topic right now. So I'm very excited, as I said earlier, to be having this topic at this appropriate time. Let's start out a little bit about your background. You're a seasoned security professional with extensive experience in global security operations and risk management. Your career spans over 30 years, during which you've had an extensive amount of threat assessment work, developed complete security programs, and safeguarded personnel and assets in over 70 countries. You hold an International Executive MBA from, and I'm probably going to hack this, Instituto de Empresa out of Madrid, Spain, as well as the coveted ASIS CPP certification. In addition, you're also the founder of ASIS Travel Risk Management Group. You're also an author who's published a highly regarded book, Practical Security Training, about developing effective security strategies. With a background that includes leadership roles in both the private sector and as a U.S. Marine Corps infantry officer, you obviously bring a wealth of knowledge in proactive risk management, aviation security, and international threat mitigation. You've got a great background from what I've been reading on my research, and obviously in some of the circles that we are a little connected with, you really are extremely knowledgeable in a lot of areas regarding practical security. So it's great to have you on here.
Excellent, Harry. Thank you very much.
We always like to start at the very beginning. So tell us a little bit about kind of where you're from and what led you to join the Marine Corps, and then ultimately get into the security industry and ultimately specializing in travel risk management.
Sure, absolutely, Harry. And every time I hear the information inside of my bio, especially the part about spanning over 30 years, I feel old when I hear that. But I grew up in Manhattan, actually, back in the 70s and 80s. Went in the Marine Corps after college in '89. Went to OCS, and I was always kind of interested in the Marine Corps from early childhood, I would say. So it was always something that was on my scope for things I was interested in trying in the future. So in the Marine Corps, as I said, I had the opportunity. I was an infantry officer. The opportunity to have some travel to Okinawa, Japan, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, including all the action that happened there in the period of 1990 into 1991. After I got the Marine Corps, the first position I had in the private sector was with a security company in New York City. And in that position, I was kind of a embed manager, so I would be on site for client facilities where I'd be overseeing the security force there. I'd be handling anything that they weren't able to handle internally. Sometimes it would be like property management firms and so forth who had no internal capabilities, so I would do investigations on site when there were issues or incidents. And I stayed at that for about 5 or 6 years, and then I moved on to a position with an international company with operations all over the world, and that was kind of my introduction to the whole travel piece, because I found myself a high percentage of my efforts and time were spent really protecting our travelers all throughout the world.
So I have come to realize, doing some work on the East Coast over the years and on the West Coast, that the style of security is very different between the two coasts. Do you find that the same?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it depends on the industry too. But I mean, when I started out, I worked in a lot of firms in the Wall Street area, and obviously it was a separate environment. I came to California in 2013, primarily because of the climate, but some other issues as well too. It gets a little cold and cloudy on the East Coast where I'm from, so out here is a little bit nicer. But yeah, I think in general there's here things seem to be a little bit more laid back, which sometimes it can be a positive and sometimes not. I think, when you're coming from a place that's more, I would say, kind of fast paced, where expectations are higher, you come to expect immediate response for things, and sometimes out here it's a little bit slower. But yeah, no, I've observed that as well too.
Excellent.
It hinges on the industry too, I think, a lot.
It does. I always, my initial entry into the industry was through a group on the East Coast, and I was showing up to interviews and details and jacket and tie and polished Brooks Brothers. And I remember when I applied for a job in California, they said, "Do not. It's jeans, t-shirt, and a Chuck Taylor." And I said, well, "What are Chuck Taylors?" I had no clue. So I get it. And that was just on the attire side of the house. The approach, the attitude, the mindset was just totally different on the West Coast when it came to security. So I'm kind of understanding the both sides of things. So everyone defines things differently, especially in the security industry. How do you define travel risk management, and how has it evolved from when you started till today?
Yeah, I think it's evolved a lot. I mean, I think in terms of defining it, and I'm sure there's something on paper here that would spell it out easier than I can articulate it, but essentially it's protecting your travelers from all types of hazards, really, and being as proactive ahead of time to try and anticipate potential problems and issues, and have things in place to either prevent that from happening or to be able to respond if something happens that's outside your control. I think as far as how it's evolved, I mean, I come very much from the security type background, and I think the past 3-4 years in particular, there's been a kind of a broader approach to all types of concerns that you can encounter as a traveler. And I think the introduction of the ISO 31030 standard, which came out in around 2021, I think that also shaped a lot of the perceptions as well. But as I got involved in this field at a greater level, I think, and started interacting with other people, one thing I found that was interesting was the perceptions were not the same, or the responsibilities were not the same. So, I mean, I came from an environment of at least interacting with other people in corporations who had very similar type jobs, and kind of went and viewed things in a similar way. But now, if you look at some of the other organizations that are sprouting up now to handle things involving travel risk, they're looking a lot more at the impacts of pandemic. They're looking at things like the impact of traveler interruptions and so forth, which are things that I wouldn't have considered to be kind of core concepts, at least in the area that I was involved with historically more.
Right. I think the industry has grown recently to where people are now looking at everything from, traffic interruptions to the pandemic. I mean, it's what security professionals are facing when it comes to journey management and travel risk is a lot greater. There's a lot more things to be concerned about that I think travelers now are starting to appreciate more and more as time goes on. They start to understand it. So, are you seeing more or less companies adopting an internal travel risk management program as time has gone on?
I think it's a higher number. There was a survey that just was out that I think had it at about 48% had some kind of formal program. Actually, I'm sorry, it was higher than that. I think it was like 78% or something like that had a kind of formal program of some kind. But of course, those programs, the shape of them can vary a lot depending on the type of organization it is, the corporate culture, etc.
What do you feel are some components of a successful risk management program? I mean, do they start at the very beginning with some awareness campaigns with new hires to full-on protection details, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's starts with a variety of things. I think you have to make sure that you are preparing your travelers for travel in some way. And again, how you do that can depend a lot upon the culture of the organization, the resources you have, and so forth. But some type of either materials which are accessible for them, or strategies to go put information out to them, up to more formal training programs, I think is an important aspect. I think having a component where you are tying in intel as well to understand the areas where your travelers are going and what type of issues they could possibly face and confront, having the ability to respond when incidents happen, and having the ability to put steps in place to safeguard the traveler in travel, particularly for areas which are higher risk. And that can be anything from journey management to other facets, evaluation of hotels you're staying at, and so forth. But again, whatever the program is, it's got to be scalable and appropriate for the organization, I think.
And would you design those in certain categories or certain layers for certain types of employees?
Yeah, I think it starts with, well, I think it starts with a few things, but I think it starts with the kind of nature of travel at your organization. So you have organizations where the majority of the travelers are going to places which are fairly benign, and they can be handled at a fairly, I don't want to say at a surface type level, because I think that's unfair, but I think you don't need the same type of in-depth steps that you need if you're sending people to areas which are higher risk. And I think the majority of organizations, it's a mix. I think the majority of organizations, at least where I talk to people, the majority of folks are traveling places which are fairly benign, and there's a subset which are traveling to areas which are higher risk. And then obviously you start speaking about the extractives industry, oil, for example, mining and so on. They're usually in areas which are higher risk. NGOs, international aid organizations, are usually areas which are higher risk, and higher education also sometimes. So I think depending on the area that your travelers are going, you sort of have to kind of tailor it for that. And then also the scope of your travel program. I use an example very often. I have a colleague, I believe that she's got about 80,000 travelers that she has responsibility for. Now, with 80,000 travelers, it's quite hard to do a bespoke type program for each traveler and each individual trip. So at some point, if you're in that type of situation, you need to have some type of way of triaging the areas which are higher risk, being able to see when you have people going areas which are higher risk, and putting a higher focus on that, even if it means you're kind of taking some energy off the other individuals who are traveling to places which aren't as concerning.
Yeah. So kind of along those lines, I've had during my career folks that have resisted any form of security during travel. They come up with a reason. For example, I've traveled this part of the world many times. I know my way around. It's safe. I've done this before. Or, the company I'm visiting, they're taking care of security and transportation. And it's a challenge. I'm sure you've had that once or twice in your career. How do you respond to that? How do you address that? And what are the ways to, over time, win those folks over so that's not a consistent problem with them when they travel?
Yeah, I think when I think about travelers, I think about them as a horseshoe shape. When you look at the spectrum of travelers within an organization, it's almost a horseshoe. One end of the horseshoe, you're going to have the travelers who are very experienced, and sometimes they're so experienced that they are complacent and they feel like, I've been everywhere, I know everything, you can't tell me anything, and so forth. Then on the other end of that spectrum, you very often will have travelers who have hardly any experience, and they can either be like very concerned about it and quite timid about travel, where they have to be provided information and assurances to provide them confidence. And you can have travelers who completely aren't thinking about this aspect at all. They're not thinking about their safety at all in terms of travel. And the idea of traveling to somewhere else and thinking it's not exactly like it is here it's a concept that they haven't even stopped and kind of thought about and considered. And then between the either ends of the spectrum, you've got everybody in between, right? And that's where the majority of people are, somewhere on that spectrum, depending on their experience and their attitudes and so forth. And I think you need to be able to kind of go speak to each of those audiences of the place that they are. I think to the traveler who rejects your attempts at security or adding things on, and sometimes it comes in terms of restrictions. So you might have travelers who go into an area which is higher risk. You might want to restrict them and say, look, you should stay in the hotel, eat your meals in the hotel because it's higher risk. You don't want to eat on the economy in this area or go sightseeing or what have you. And I think sometimes you have to articulate the best argument you can, explain how you can help them with their travel, facilitate them and so forth, explain the things you can do and can't do. But then ultimately, I feel like you're still in an advisory type position. You can't hold every traveler's hand throughout the world. And at some point, the onus and some of the responsibility is going to be on that traveler to kind of take the information you provided, the insights you provided, any type of guidance and so forth, and internalize that and act upon it. And if they choose to not do that, then you're going to be more in a response mode after something happens, I think.
So when you communicate these risks with the employees and you give your pitch and try to get them to understand, what is the approach you're taking? Is it explaining what others have gone through? Is it explaining previous incidences, or how do you approach that?
Well, I think you have to be as sober as possible with it. I think you have to make sure you're not creating a situation that's going to make them unduly concerned. And a lot of that comes down to the nature of the travel that they're doing. So I think, to start with or to frame it, you really need to understand probably three things on the travel. You need to understand the area the person is traveling to. You need to understand, at least up to a certain degree, who the traveler is, with understandings for concerns about privacy and all these other aspects. But something of the profile of the traveler, and then you need to understand one of the more important aspects, I think, that is underappreciated, is the type of activity that the traveler's involved in, who they're going to meet with, what they're doing, and so forth. And then I think understanding all of that, you can tailor that best to the individual. So even if they're traveling to an area that's higher risk, you can help them, discuss with them how to make their behaviors there, the things they have to do and accomplish, as safe as possible. And I think you do that by highlighting ways that they can have a smaller amount of exposure in public, as an example, in certain places, a smaller amount of transportation and going back and forth if it's unnecessary, or if you're able to go restrict how you, if you have a traveler who's heading somewhere to have certain meetings, let's say, if they can have them at the hotel or somewhere in the vicinity of the hotel and not have to travel across town or to a separate town outside of the city that they're in or something like that. Any type of advice to kind of structure that, I think, is helpful. And I think articulating the ways that it's going to help them overall and ease the possibility of something bad happening. I think you can interject in there, if you need to, sometimes examples of things that have happened with other travelers. But I think you do have to be cautious about trying to kind of not sell from a position of fear. So I think you don't want to hype the person up or tell them a bunch of horror stories. I think you want to try and be as kind of even-handed with this, even-keeled as you can be with it, and state it as simply fact. If you follow our procedures and do X, Y, and Z, you're going to be safer than if you do A, B, and C, which is how you probably were thinking of handling it at the beginning, if that makes sense. Yeah,
no, it definitely does. We've had details where we have encouraged folks to stay at the hotel for their meetings, stay at the hotel. It's a tough sell sometimes because folks want to get out. They've been cooped up in an office all day, or they've been cooped up in the hotel and they just want to get out. But they don't have a plan when they leave. And so we're just going to catch an Uber, we're going to catch a taxi, and they don't understand the ramifications sometime of that. So let me ask you, as a follow-up to that, do you find it useful where you collect information from travelers when they return to share on future trips with other travelers?
Yeah, I think it's extremely helpful. I think the challenge that you sometimes have with that is uh, both for cooperation for response at all, right? I mean, it's like any other kind of survey. You're going to have people are too busy or they all do it later type thing. And so I think being able to kind of capture that information is challenging sometimes. And I think the other part is sometimes there may be a tendency to kind of downplay things. Oh, no, everything was fine or whatever, without thinking through everything. How could things have been improved upon and so forth? Or occasionally the other extreme, where you have people who were unhappy with everything and felt they should have been escorted by armed people the whole time and so forth. So I think certainly it's in our interest to go solicit that feedback. I think that's 100% it's in our interest. But I think we have to be practical and kind of reasonable about the reality of how much information we're going to have back sometimes, and how that can be colored by perception, bias, and other factors as well.
Yeah. With as many countries as you have experience in, how do you adapt travel security strategies based on specific threats and challenges for different regions?
Well, I think you look at the area and see what type of things are trending there and kind of focus on that. I mean, one of the ones I've encountered a lot through my experience is civil unrest. It's a very common issue that happens in areas of the world and things like that. So I think when I look at a particular area where we're sending travelers, I'm looking at the crime. Is it petty crime or confrontational crime? Are there issues there with unrest? Are there constant protests and so forth, which are happening? And if so, are they concentrated in a certain area? Are they always happening at the same area? Because in the majority of cities in the world, you'll have certain focal points where all that activity happens. And if you can choose a hotel that's outside of those areas, that's ordinarily preferable. Looking to see if there's a concerns about terrorism or insurgency in that area. Looking to see if there's issues with instability. Is there going to be a attempted coup when you have travelers there, or something of that nature that you're going to have to manage? So I think understanding the kind of threat environment is an important aspect to start with, to decide the things that you need to put in place, from hotel selection to journey management to any type of response that you may have to have if something ends up happening there.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question regarding selection of, like, say, transportation and hotels. What do you factor in when you make those recommendations, and what do you do to vet those companies? What are the things you're looking for? What are the questions are you asking?
Sure, I'll handle each of those individually for both hotels and transportation. And I think I'll start off by saying, whenever possible, if you can be there on site in person and see it, it's always better. Always better. But as a practical matter, especially for organizations who have travelers all throughout the world all the time, it can be very challenging. But if you're able to stop and see things in person, or see operations in person, if you're looking at transportation, it's always valuable. For hotels, I think you're looking at what are the trends in the environment. Generally speaking, and I underline that because it is extremely general, but ordinarily, for both the standpoint of the quality of the accommodation and the type of things they have in place in terms of security, medical response, and so forth, a lot of times you'll do better with a chain hotel. The problem with chain hotels is that in the hotel industry now, the majorities are not owned by the actual parent company. There are franchises or other types of setups. So the degree of control sometimes is not what you would think it is when it comes to all these elements. And certain places in the world, you may be staying at a higher end hotel, and if there's concerns about terrorism, there's probably a greater chance of it being targeted than if you're staying at a smaller hotel, or a hotel that is not as obvious of a target. And also, in some areas of the world, these hotels are kind of like a gathering point for individuals in the society locally, right? Because they've got higher end restaurants and things of that nature. So a lot of times you have to think about who's in that hotel. Are they people who are exposed, who maybe would be targeted by some third party, where you have travelers in the hotel who are not necessarily targeted, but they're still are at collateral risk because of whatever else is happening in that hotel. So oftentimes a chain hotel or higher end hotels offer advantages, but you just have to look at the context of the situation. And sometimes areas where there's concerns about terrorism and so forth, you're smarter with a smaller hotel or something that's isn't as obvious. However, in general, if you're looking at things like card access on the elevators to restrict who gets upstairs, any type of access control into the hotel, are they screening people who are coming in? What's the quality of that screening? That's why it's important to stop there in person and see it, because a lot of hotels in areas which are higher risk, you'll see x-ray machines and so forth and magnetometers, but the reality is they're not really being employed properly, or they're not being employed in a kind of method that will stop anything necessarily. And a lot of times that's because within the hospitality industry, you have that ongoing tension, right? You need to provide a safe place for all your guests, but at the same time, you don't want to create an environment where it seems like it's a high-end fortress and so on. So for hotels, I think looking at the environment and seeing how the steps the hotel has in place, how they fit that environment is going to be important. When it comes to transportation, it can be quite challenging. I think to begin with, you need to, again, look at the threat environment and see what's appropriate in that environment. Is the primary concern, is it traffic accidents, which is a concern almost everywhere, really. One of the higher probability incidents your travelers will probably encounter traffic accidents. So I think looking at that versus, are there concerns about carjackings or kidnappings or other things? Are you only looking to get a driver who's a safe driver, who's had some vetting and some training, but maybe not all that focused on security, but he can go between A and B without having an accident? Or do you go a step up from that and get somebody who's got that training, but they also have some cognizance of the environment, and they understand what indicators are in the environment that could be the signs of an issue or potential problem, all the way up to having drivers who are trained in evasive driving techniques, adding in EP agents as well, adding in follow vehicles, escort teams, and so forth, armored vehicles in areas which are higher end. So I think understanding the environment to see, okay, in this environment, I think it would be appropriate to use a safe driver, or we want a driver who has had security training, and we want an EP agent also in the car with them. And then the challenge after that is to find the provider in that environment who can do that, right? And a lot of times, again, we're not talking about Paris and Amsterdam and places of that type where you can ordinarily find people who have all those capabilities. But when you're looking at Bamako, Mali, or Kinshasa, or somewhere in Central Asia, Almaty, Kazakhstan, or somewhere like that, understanding that you have a smaller pool of options in those places, a smaller pool of capabilities, what is the best option that fits that environment and is adequate for you? And I think understanding that is important, because I think a lot of times, particularly if you have individuals who are accustomed to working in markets where there are a lot of choices and there are a lot of capable choices, once you start getting off the beaten path further afield, you start to have a harder time to kind of find those assets out there.
Yeah. Do you, so historically, when I have done assessments on either hotels or transportation services, I have gone and utilized their services and had the same experience that the travel will have. And oftentimes I will sit in the lobby and simply just watch, spend a couple hours and see who's coming in the late afternoon, who's coming in for tea, who's if it appears locals are having dinner versus are there, a lot of international travelers, and are folks just watching. I'm watching what used to be taxis now, obviously with Ubers and rideshare. There's a lot of cars out in front just simply hanging out, and even the food delivery, the Grubhub or whatever you call those. Do you find that that's a value to take some time to visit those places and simply watch and assess things? And then when you get that information, who are you going back to deliver that?
100%. I mean, I think if I were to offer a blueprint for handling that, I would say something quite similar to how you explained or described it. I think with the hotels, I think there are kind of a couple of approaches that you can do. You can make contact with the hotel ahead of time. You can schedule a walkthrough and so forth, and you'll see obviously areas that you would not if you just were in there as a person off the street or if you're staying in the hotel. But you'll also see things as they would like to show you them as well too. They know you're auditing them. They've been through a million audits and inspections before. They know the type of things you're interested in, and they know how to show you the things you're interested in seeing. The other approach is you don't make contact with anyone there at all. You stay in the hotel, perhaps. You spend time there. As you said, you hang around in the common areas. You see what type of people are there, what happens in the evening. Is there a casino in the hotel? What type of people are coming in for the casino? Is there a shopping mall? And if so, are there controls between the shopping mall and the hotel if it's attached? All those things. Now, you can also put a combination of those approaches in and schedule an appointment on Tuesday or Wednesday at the hotel and come in there Monday, spend time observing it so you see it unpolished, let's say, without them putting a show on for you necessarily. And then you can get a more in-depth exposure with the hotel when you do a walkthrough with either the manager for security or front desk or sales or whomever it is. So I think, again, if you have the time and the capability, that's the ideal approach. And the same thing on providers like concerning transportation. I mean, what I will do in general, if I have the time, if I'm traveling somewhere, is I will arrange to get transportation from 2 or 3 providers in that location. So I'll get somebody to pick me up from the airport. I'll get somebody else to take me to a meeting, somebody else to pick me up from that meeting, somebody else in order to head to the airport. And I can evaluate each of them and the experience, the quality of experience, and so forth. And a lot of times with things of that nature, it can be issues which are very basic. Is there fuel in the car? Do they have to stop and fuel up when you're still inside the car with them? And I've had that experience in a variety of places. Do they know how to follow instructions and so on? So I think it gives you the opportunity to evaluate and see what the experience is and to see what the issues are. So, and then as far as how I take that information, I compile that information afterwards on paper where I outline everything I've basically seen with the hotels, with transportation, with the environment in general. I'll stop at the embassy if I can or consulate there, speak to the RSO. If I've been able to speak to any contacts or peers through OSAC as an example, I'll try and have conversations when I'm in there, again, hinging on how long I'm staying in a place. And when I come out of that, I have a product that basically provides me insight on the environment, provides me insight on the hotels, the transportation, and then any other type of factors I might have to look at that are specific on that trip. And a lot of times I put that on paper and I'll pass that up the chain, but to be honest, I put it on paper so that I can look back at it afterwards and I'll say, oh yeah, I remember this. Because if you're on a trip and you're visiting 3, 4, 5 cities on that trip and doing something similar in each of those places, I don't know about you or anybody else, but I get them mixed up. So I need to put that stuff down on paper somewhere, and then I can look at it and think back, oh yeah, over here they had canines outside the hotel and they were checking every third car, but they didn't check me when I went in, but they were checking locals. All these other kind of factors, I can add them in there, and it helps me afterwards. And then if there's an issue or concern or a problem happens there, I can say, I was there, I saw the hotel, this is how, when I saw it, this is what I experienced.
Yeah, that's some excellent points. So with many travel security programs, there's country risk ratings that where there's countries where there's no issue all the way up to what we like to view as no-go locations. But we all know that there are some valid reasons out there for folks to be in some high-risk countries, depending on the work they're doing. How should organizations approach risk management for those situations where basically avoiding that country is not an option? They have to go.
Well, I think I'll start by saying that I think when you're evaluating an area, that all those things, whether it's considered to be like the country's green or red or orange or level 4 or 5, however it is that you choose to characterize it. A lot of times it's a helpful starting point, but you want to look beyond the country, look more at the city or the area that they are traveling specifically to, because you could have a country where it's high risk because there's an insurgency that's going on in the interior, but if it's not affecting things in the capital city, it probably is not impacting your individuals, other than if they're heading out into the interior, into affected areas. So I think understanding the area that they're traveling to and understanding that particular scoring system, how does that tie in the context of the travel, I think is extremely important. As far as assuming you've decided that the area is high risk that they'll be in, the country, the city, the neighborhood, whatever else is high risk, but the traveler has to go there anyway because of a kind of critical need, then I think you need to start looking at how do you manage it, like we talked about earlier, to get the smallest amount of exposure possible. So if the traveler is heading in there, again, for a typical thing, perhaps they're going for a couple meetings or to go visit a customer or a supplier, to be able to narrow down their exposure or their footprint the smallest amount. Can you find a hotel that's adjacent to or close in the area of who they need to see in that example, so that you don't have them having to travel across town and transit a bunch of areas which are high risk and be exposed in transit like that, because we know that from historical examples that a lot of times when individuals are kind of targeted or when they are most vulnerable is in transit. So being able to kind of have a smaller window for them to be exposed in transit is going to be an important part. And then deciding on, do we need to put anyone at their hotel with them? Do we need anyone to stay overnight with them at their hotel? Do we need to have a team in the parking lot of their hotel if something happens overnight where they have to be evacuated or something of that nature? So again, depending on the threat, being able to think through the types of scenarios or situations the traveler could possibly find themselves in, and developing procedures to A, reduce the possibility of that happening, but B, to have a response in place if something happens that happens anyway, even though you've had all these other aspects in place. And then, of course, it ends up getting more challenging if you are working in impoverished areas or dealing with people in the population locally and things like that. And you'll have that with international aid organizations and so forth, where they have to be out in the communities and so forth. So in those type of cases, a lot of times they and I'm not an NGO guy, but they employ an acceptance strategy where they get stakeholders in those types of areas and communities who can kind of vouch for them and say, listen, this person's coming here for a positive reason. They're coming here to help us. We don't want them to be interfered with. So I think it depends a lot on the type of area they're traveling to, and I think it depends a lot on what their objectives are. But basically, to have this exposure be as small as possible and have plans in place for probable issues you may encounter.
Yeah. So how crucial do you find real-time intelligence in managing risk programs today? And can you kind of walk us through how intelligence is integrated into today's programs?
I think it's extremely important. I mean, I think to start with, as we spoke about, understanding the environment in the area that you're sending travelers. So understanding what the trends are there, what type of things happen there, what type of experiences other individuals who have been traveling there have had. So that's more at the macro level. And then I think understanding incidents which, as they're occurring, how they could impact your travelers. And that's why it's important to have a methodology for knowing the areas you have travelers at any particular time. Because I think the majority of us who've been involved in this for any amount of time have had a situation happen somewhere. Maybe it was an earthquake or a bombing or something happened where the first response is, well, do we have anybody there? So having a methodology to find those people, and there's a variety of avenues to approach that, everything from tracking apps on phones to tracking traveler data to a variety of separate things that maybe some are easier maybe or faster, some are a little bit harder or more complicated, but having procedures in place to be able to establish who you have in the affected area when something happens. And how you do that is going to depend on resources within your organization, but also on a company culture and so forth. Because you have a lot of organizations where there will be pushback against having apps on their phones and things of that nature. And a lot of times, even if there's not overt pushback, you'll have situations where the apps are available to employees, but they don't activate them on their phones. So understanding that you may have to try a couple of avenues in order to establish who's in somewhere. It's not always going to be a single answer, but understanding that when an incident occurs, who do we have there? Are we able to have comms with them, which is always a challenge in these incidents? But are we able to have comms with them to establish what their status is? Are they okay? Are they in a position which is hazardous? And then help them through how to respond. Are they going to evacuate the area or get out of the area that's affected, or is it safer for them to stay there and shelter in place until things are calmer? So all those things are kind of ways Intel will help out in that situation.
So with things like cyber risk, health pandemics, protests, geopolitical tensions becoming more and more prevalent, how do you see the travel risk management programs adapting to these emerging changes?
Yeah, I think those are excellent examples. I think the stuff on the cyber piece, it's going to hinge somewhat on the organization. You have some organizations, well, let me start with it. Every organization, the intellectual property is important, and they're going to all want to go safeguard that. But for some organizations, it may really mean their ultimate, if they are able to survive or not, right? If their business is so dependent on their intellectual property, then they may need to put restrictions on who can travel internationally with company equipment. What does that look like? What type of things are they able to do when they're in certain countries, or perhaps anywhere internationally, and so forth. And I think for other organizations where intellectual property is not as much the crown jewels of the existence of the organization, and the threat is not as existential, then I think you need to look at how can we put this in place so that we, educate our employees on things which are safe from a cyber hygiene standpoint and things which are not safe. And then also understand what type of access do we restrict when they're overseas and so on. And then, of course, the kind of capability to if a device is compromised or stolen or lost, can somebody in your IT group remove that information, at least within a period of time before it's compromised. And then I think finally, as with anything on the cyber side, there's always going to be a balance or a play between adequate protection and functionality. And I think the majority have experienced the time where you had cyber protections were so tight that it really hindered you on functionality. So you need someone in the organization, most times will be higher up in the organization, who has to look at this and say, what balance are we willing to strike between the functionality and the protection of our cyber assets? So I think on the cyber side, I think that's an interesting one. I think it's an emerging one that that we all have to focus on. But for some organizations, it's super critical. In terms of pandemic, I think with the pandemic, we saw how travelers were stranded all throughout the world when that happened. And then you find yourself in the situation of trying to have them return home, which can be challenging if there are no flights. So I think we learned a lot from that experience, particularly the onset of it. To understand that we could get in a situation like that where we have people who are trapped all throughout the world, and be able to think through how can we return those individuals in a as safely as possible, and as early as we can, as soon as their restrictions are off or lifted. And then the other part of the pandemic, obviously, which we all experienced, or quite a few of us, was the impact on travel inside of the pandemic itself. So after the initial couple months of the pandemic, when people started traveling again, you got into a very complicated situation where every country had their own protocols, right? And the protocols were constantly changing. So if I have to travel between two different countries, do I have to take COVID tests? How long beforehand? Who do I have to submit that to? Etc. And it made a challenge for a pretty extended period of time. I traveled over COVID. I didn't travel as often as I had before COVID, but I certainly traveled over COVID, and it was a constantly changing evolutionary process of what are the procedures, apps for monitoring in certain countries, having to take a COVID test in order to leave the country, areas where you might have to quarantine. If you're quarantining, you're quarantining in a hotel or you're quarantining in a hospital somewhere. So I think that at the same time, we don't, I think after the pandemic, we don't have any easy answers, but we have a greater appreciation of the kind of impact it can have, and we can kind of think through some of the responses for that, I think.
So let me ask you a two-part question. One, do you think the corporate traveler today versus 3 years ago is a lot smarter and a lot aware of what could happen during travel? And two, have countries gotten smarter in their approach and their response in the last couple of years?
Well, I think my answer to both the first one and the second one is I hope so. I'm not necessarily convinced though on either account. I mean, I think in general, as people, we tend to have short memories, and even as impactful as COVID was, I think with the return to travel, I think a lot of people aren't thinking about that, or they're thinking, well, we're not likely to have that happen again in the short term, and they're probably right. It may not be that, but it may be something else, and I'm not sure the extrapolating the experience of COVID to other types of crises has happened for the average individual who's traveling. So I still think the average traveler is a little bit more relaxed about some things than they probably should be, at least some of the time. Although at the same time, I think things that in the past were not as appreciated, like the impact involving mental health and so forth. I think all those things, I think when you have travelers at least of a certain age now, the expectations are higher that the company will be able to help them through issues that they may have when they're traveling and so forth. And I think, for us, individuals from an older type generation who may have had the attitude of, push on or whatever, suck it up. I think we need to become somewhat more understanding of that, empathetic and sensitive to the fact that there are these concerns in travelers, and we need to have things in place to help a person if they are somewhere overseas and they have like a personal issue of some kind or a crisis of some kind that impacts them. And then the other part as to countries, again, I would like to think that we learned a lot through that, but I'm not sure that we necessarily did. I think a lot of times when you're dealing with a bureaucracy, and especially in emerging markets, I think it's hard sometimes for common sense to end up coming into play with these things, and people follow the procedures, say A, B, and C, and I do A, B, and C, even if it isn't helpful. So,
yeah. So, security is always a budget that is constantly shrinking, and there's a reduction in staff, and many EP agents have had the responsibility now to take on some form of travel security. They just don't have the support, and they're just doing their due diligence to ensure that the protectee is traveling in a safe manner. When planning or conducting international travel, what specific vulnerabilities should protective teams be aware of, not just for the principal, but for themselves when they travel?
Yeah, I think that's actually an excellent topic. I think particularly for EP agents who may have had the majority of their experience here in the United States, as an example, or similar countries, so Canada, the UK, whatever, or perhaps they were traveling with a principal who went to areas which were similar. And now they are starting to go, to other parts of the world and further afield. I think the first thing is, if the EP agent is accompanying the principal and they have a problem, it's an issue because they have a problem themselves, but they've also impacted the effectiveness of their mission, right? I mean, they are there to protect the individual who they're traveling with, and if they get detained or if they have some other kind of problem, then A, they're not able to do what they need to do, and B, it may actually have a kind of blowback on that individual as well, because of the association. So I think one of the first things I would say for EP agents who are traveling is look at the things that you're carrying, and be sure everything you're carrying is A, accepted and permissible in the areas you're going to, and B, even if it's not illegal, is it something that will go and draw undue attention or cause issues? So, as an example, there's something like 15 countries, I think, in the world where there's a prohibition against carrying in a camouflage clothing, and we could extrapolate that to other things that are military in appearance. So, it's something the majority of us probably wouldn't think about or think twice about. But if you have equipment that has that look to it, it can cause you a problem. So, or if you're carrying things like, for example, tourniquets, or certainly body armor is an excellent example. So anything of that type, you want to be sure first before you carry it into a place that there are not restrictions on it. An important one also are satellite phones, right? Understanding if you're traveling with satellite phones, there are parts of the world that either it's completely restricted or you need to get approval in advance, and that's a whole separate exercise. So understanding, are there things that if you get stopped at the airport and they open up your bags and they find this stuff, you're going to have a serious problem. And then the next step up from that is understanding, are there things that maybe aren't illegal, but they could be problematic? So say, for example, you're traveling to a country, you're carrying a bunch of tactical manuals, or you're have stuff in there. It's about ambushes or some of the stuff that you might be interested in from a professional standpoint, and this is how you entertain yourself on the aircraft or whatever. But you show up in country X in sub-Saharan Africa with that stuff in your bag, it could be a problem. Even if there is no paper that says you can't bring that in, it still is a potential issue. So I think you want to start by thinking about the stuff that you're carrying and be as sanitized as you can, and make sure that you're as harmless in terms of anything that you have on your person or in your bags. I think the other thing too is understanding your parameters in that country, your boundaries, the things you can do and can't do. Even within the United States, to provide protective services in a lot of states in the United States, you need to have a license in that state and insurance. And that's even more amplified internationally. So understanding that there may be things you can't overtly do internationally that you would be able to do in your home country is an important aspect. And that's why a lot of times you're going to want to subcontract out to providers in that area who have the licenses, have the insurance, have the approvals, and so on to be able to handle those services. And you may still have the EPA agent traveling alongside the principal, but the drivers, a lot of the other type of personnel, the advance agents, other types of personnel are people in that country locally. And then we get back to the thing we were talking about earlier about how do you decide who's good and who's bad and so forth. And a lot of that, I think, comes from peer networks. So, I've spoke about OSAC earlier, and I harp on OSAC a lot. It's an excellent opportunity to interact with other individuals who are working in the same areas of the world as you, but within the EP space as well, too. I mean, being able to establish a variety of contacts so that if you have a question, does somebody have a provider in country XYZ for ground transportation or protection or whatever it is, then being able to kind of tap that and kind of learn from others' experiences is important.
Yeah. So I traveled to Australia with two other agents, and I made it through security checkpoints, and so did one of the other agents. And all of a sudden, we were missing one, and come to find out that he had carried handcuffs as a habit, and they're not allowed there. And that caused a bit of a national incident. Of course, they reviewed the security cameras and brought us all back into the room and asked what we were doing. The answer that we were personal assistants weren't really cutting it when one of them had handcuffs. And so we had to play innocent and stupid and apologize. And it was an incident. And so ever since then, while we were all working together, we would always ask, hey, what are you carrying? The tourniquet is another thing that it's a common tool now, but some countries could consider that as a weapon or as a primer to look into something else into you. So I think it's definitely something important to consider. So what are some of the most overlooked aspects in travel risk management protective teams should be looking at and should be considering?
Well, I think adding on to the things we already spoke about earlier, and a lot of that is about understanding the environment that you're traveling to and understanding the context of the trip in relationship with the environment and the profile of the principal in that context. Is there anything special about that individual that might attract attention or might be an exposure that you wouldn't normally have? So I think all those areas that we spoke about earlier. I think the other thing, which kind of ties into the stuff we're talking about now, is also just about behavior in general. And a prime example would be looking for cameras in the hotel room and similar type behavior like that. So, and this is a fairly common thing, and you see it discussed a lot in conferences and online groups and things like that. How do we look for cameras or potentially bugs and so forth in these rooms? But understanding, again, particularly areas where there's been more history of political instability, where there's been concerns about foreign involvement, things like that, you don't want to be in there causing them undue concern by your behavior. So if you go into your hotel room and you're pulling out your camera and checking everywhere for any signs of a camera in the room and things like that, or worse, you've got equipment specifically for that somehow you didn't get stopped on the way in the country carrying, but you have it at the hotel or the office or whatever else, but the hotel especially. All that behavior is going to have the people in the security services at that country want to have an eye on you. They're going to say, well, this odd that this individual is searching for cameras in their hotel room, or it's odd that they are, walking outside the hotel and they seem like they're checking for surveillance, and they are going around the block twice, and they're making stops and coming back out, and all this other types of odd behavior. And a lot of times, speaking about hotels, in fact, in a high number of places, the hotels have an obligation to provide information to the internal services of that country, who's staying in the hotel and things of that nature. And a lot of times, in some places, those services will have people in the hotel as well. So if you start behaving in a way that looks like you are too much a professional, if you will, it can draw hostile interest in you, where they're like, who is this person? Why are they behaving this way? And so forth. So I think it's important for EP agents to accomplish what they need to do, but to do it in as benign and harmless a way as possible, and to try and stay off of the appearance of being either too military or indications that you might be involved in some kind of espionage or something like that. I think all those are things that you want to have in mind, again, particularly in those areas which are higher risk. I mean, Australia's a great example because we kind of think of Australia as like here, right? It's like the same thing. But you take Australia and amplify it when you talk about areas Central Asia, Southeast Asia, or Sub-Saharan Africa, and so forth, where there's oftentimes an understandable paranoia or concern about individuals because they've had a history of coups and foreign involvement and all these other things. So,
yeah. Related but unrelated. When I've talked to folks about travel and what to do and what not to do, we've even talked to EP agents about the typical, you can't be wearing 511 pants and a sling bag, black sling bag. You just, and hiking boots. You're just going to stick out. And I just was in Miami for something, and my wife and I were at dinner, and we picked up on two EP agents because of the way, well, she did. Had my back to another direction, but she's like, those pants are a dead giveaway. And this what is that bag? And of course, it's a 511 bag, and it's black, and it says I'm security, and I've got a gun, or I'm somebody. And so we always talk about that, because in foreign countries, that's not the norm. And you're definitely going to stick out when you walk outside of a hotel and you're standing there and you're watching things. You're attracting attention. So I completely agree with you. You have to be as nonchalant and benign as you can be to not draw attention to yourself, because you're probably there ahead of the principal, and you're just causing your problems earlier than you should have. So.
Yeah, I think that everyone became familiar with that contractor look after kind of GWAT and things like that, and then the slew of TV shows, movies, and things like that went to all areas of the world. So I think you stand out 100% if you have that on, and you don't stand out in a good way. I think you need to know a lot of places you're not going to be able to blend in with the population locally. Right. I mean, I know I'm not, right? I'm not going to sub-Saharan Africa and it's going to be easier, seamless where I blend in, but I can be as unobtrusive as I can be. I can be as kind of plain looking as I can be without all those extra trappings and so forth. Yes, 100%.
Right, I agree. So looking back on your career, can you share a situation where effective travel risk management for either you or a company has made a significant difference in the outcome?
Yeah, I think a few, actually. I'm trying to think of ones that are the kind of best example. I think one of the quickest and seamless ones, and a great example involving the importance of peer networks and so forth was Israel. Whereas a situation where there were some individuals in Israel on October 7th. My organization, we didn't have a contract at the time with a provider in Israel, but I had extended relationships with providers there over 20 years. And because of those relationships, we were able to evacuate the individuals within hours, actually, of the incident happening on October 7th and get them out of the country. I think an incident I was involved in Central Asia with individuals who had to shelter in place for about 10 days when civil unrest was going on. I think, again, both because of planning and understanding how to adapt a plan on the fly, we had looked at evacuating these individuals to a neighboring country over road, and because of intel that we were receiving, we discovered that there were issues on that road, so we had to go and stop with that plan, alternate to a secondary plan, and so forth. And I think that it showed the advantages of intel in that case. It showed the advantages of prior planning, and then being able to kind of take that plan and modify it as you kind of have to as circumstances change. Yeah.
For organizations looking to bolster their travel security protocols, what are the most important factors they should be considering when they're going to develop or refining their travel risk program?
I think, again, the priorities somewhat are going to depend on the organization, but I think a good place to start really is the ISO 31030, because I think it gives you a good framework, and you can look at what you have in place now, if anything, and understand, okay, here are the kind of things I want to aspire to. I have seen programs that I thought were very good on paper, but I question how well they would hold up under an incident which is a serious incident, because it kind of ticks all the boxes. So I think you want to look at a framework like ISO 31030, and then I think you want to look at the things that you're doing right now. I think you want to look at gaps in there, and I think you want to, beyond that, start to kind of benchmark and speak with peers and so forth to see how are they handling things in a similar circumstances. Now, Again, I have a smaller number of travelers. I have a colleague at another organization has 80,000. The way we're going to approach things are going to be entirely different, but we still at the end have the same obligation to try and provide a safe environment for employees on travel. So,
yeah. Well, good. So from the formal side of the house, that was my last question. On the more personal side, we like to always close out with a few rapid fire questions to find out a little bit more about you on the personal side. One of our standard questions is, if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
I would say probably George Washington. And I only say that because I think that was obviously a pivotal part in our history where we became a country, and that would be the opportunity to kind of understand a little bit of the founding fathers' insights into how they were thinking as they kind of move forward and so forth.
Excellent. What's that one place you've traveled to that it's been at the top of your list? It's been one of the best experiences you've had.
That's a tough one to answer, but I'm going to say actually Cambodia. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but I traveled over there a couple times for work, and I got a chance to travel there on vacation in August. It was a great opportunity to kind of see some of the things that I wouldn't have seen, the history, Angkor Wat, and so forth, that I wouldn't have had an opportunity to have exposure to with my ordinary travel involving work. So
excellent. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Probably to go set the example. So what you expect from others, you want to go and kind of model that.
And what's the most important lesson you've learned from failure?
It's an important lesson I've learned from failure. I think to be aware of my shortcomings and to focus on improving on them, and to be aware of my interactions with others and how I'm perceived.
Two more. What's your favorite quote or mantra that you live by?
Well, that's a really tough one. I could say probably Semper Fi, just because I'm a Marine, and that's the easy answer.
I figured that one. And so, look, travel, security in general, and life in general is stressful and tough. How does someone in your position disconnect? Or do you?
I mean, I certainly try to. I mean, I think we're in a situation right now where, like, we're always on our phones right all the time. Like, we always have to have it because of some issue that could pop up or crises or what have you. I try to spend time outside, exercise, a lot of hiking and stuff. I'm in an area where hiking is easy, and that's a great activity to kind of be out apart from people or whatever in nature and stuff, which is nice.
Excellent. Well, Patrick, this has been a great hour. I appreciate you coming on. You're very insightful. We definitely have some similar thoughts and approaches on travel risk management and how travelers should behave when they're both inside and outside of the country. So I really appreciate you coming on board.
Yeah, it was an excellent conversation, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. Links for today's guest can be found in the show notes. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to stay up to date on our latest episodes. You can also follow us on Instagram, check out our YouTube channel, and visit our website at morethanthegun.com for more content. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where together we'll explore the many layers of our profession and discover what truly makes it more than the gun. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of More Than the Gun or its host.